Welcome to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE and observability 1 week at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend. Welcome back to Slight Reliability. I'm Stephen Townsend, and this is the show where we learn about SRE and observability 1 week at a time. Bruce Cullen is back. Hi,
Hello.
Bruce.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me back for more.
Bruce, very recently, went to KubeCon in Amsterdam, was it?
It was indeed in Amsterdam, yes. Great place to have a conference.
I would have loved to have been there, but I wasn't. But Bruce was, and so we're here to talk today about KubeCon, what was happening there, what he took away from that, and you just get the general experience, because I've never been to a KubeCon before. So to start with, can I ask, what is KubeCon? What is it? Because when I first heard about it, I just assumed it was a conference explicitly about Kubernetes. But it sounds like it's more of a general cloud native open source conference. Is that right?
Right. You are spot on. So I'm guessing, but I don't know this for certain, that it was once a Kubernetes only conference, and that over time things, as tech has developed, have changed. So its full name is KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon Europe. Obviously less of a catchy title than KubeCon, so everyone just calls it KubeCon, but that's its full title. So the focus isn't just on Kubernetes, but obviously that does kind of play a part. It's an absolutely massive event. I've been to quite a few big events in the past, some on the same scale, but it did feel, I haven't been to one this big in a while. I think it was 10,000 attendees, and yeah.
That's decent.
That's very decent. Can't argue with that. And there's some pictures that will illustrate this. The expo is always a good measure for how big or small an event is, how much the vendors want to pay to be there. And it was like a 2-hall thing. The expo was absolutely massive. But as you say, also, open source projects there as well. And this was reinforced in kind of 2 ways. That the first day technically the day before KubeCon, were co-located events. And they had, how many is that? 9, I think it was, co-located events the day before. And I focused on Observability Day, that being my kind of interest and area of focus. But yeah, and they also had sort of booths that weren't just for vendors, but for the open source projects, which was very cool. Because then you get a bit deeper, you get to ask all the stupid questions like, what is your project all about? You're just expected to know otherwise. There is a lot out there, but absolutely massive event. And yeah, as you say, not just focused on Kubernetes.
The co-hosted events, can you just, what do you mean by that? Is that like mini conferences within the same conference space run by different groups? Like, what is that about?
Yeah, essentially. So one thing I should have said already, I guess taking a step back, is the Linux Foundation that are responsible for all of the above, including the CNCF, and they put on this event. And the very first day is, co-hosted events. So they're in the same venue space, but rather than it being dedicated to a single massive event, they slice the space up and dedicate rooms to certain sub-events. Which is quite a nice idea, because ultimately these are all linked to or relate or are projects from the CNCS. So Argo being an example, Psyllium being another example, that are projects in themselves rather than a topic like Observability Day. But yeah, they're all kind of co-located in the same site, which is on one hand quite convenient, but on the other hand, you have to register for them individually, and you pay an extra to go to the first day. The paying extra bit, fine, no big issues with that. It's the having to register for each thing individually that's a bit annoying, because you have got to figure out what you want to go to way before, at the point you put your credit card in.
So I am guessing that you've been to Ignite and other big sort of corporate events, vendor-based events. How did KubeCon compare to Ignite or other big events like that?
I'm just thinking about what I've done. So I've definitely done Ignite multiple times. I've done ServiceNow's Knowledge, also very corporate. And what other big things? AWS Summit in London was quite a big one that I've done in the past. They all have a slightly different feel. True of both KubeCon and anything else that's in this space. So SRECon, SRE Day going even smaller. They all have a similar feel, and it's a very different feel to the likes of a Microsoft thing. Microsoft did feel very corporate. You did get techies, but they tended to be techies. It's almost, I kind of hate even saying that term. What does it really even mean? But, essentially IT pros is how I describe them in the Microsoft space. Whereas on any event sort of more focused on SREs, and also true of KubeCon, there were people that were interested in the tech themselves, but it felt more open than something like a Microsoft, both in terms of the feel of the event, but also the people I spoke to. I was your roving reporter while out there trying to get sound bites, so it gave me a good excuse to go and say hello to a bunch of random people. It felt less stuffy. That's how I'd describe it.
Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of the people that got up and spoke, were they from vendors, or were there speakers who just do work in places and they want to share what they're doing? Or was there both, or what was it?
Really, really both. And some of the sessions were, vendor in disguise kind of sessions, where it's clearly a vendor, it's such and such from Globocorp kind of thing. And you can tell it's got a certain vendor whiff about it. There's some that were less apologetic, and almost personally, I respect that. If it's a vendor session, make it clear it's a vendor session. I will go on the basis it's a vendor session and take that knowledge with me. But there were some practitioner sessions as well. And one of my favorite sessions was as a practitioner-focused one. In fact, it was from Observability Day right at the beginning. So it was a mixed bag, and it did feel like, unlike with the likes of an AWS Summit or an Ignite or ServiceNow's Knowledge, you do get practitioners speak as well. But for the most part, it feels like there's somehow, suggested by the corporation that runs the event. Whereas this felt a lot more, again, organic and, I want to speak. Sure, that sounds great. Go speak.
That sounds like my kind of event. I think I'd like to go to a KubeCon in the future, and hopefully SRECon, which I'm going to in June in Singapore, will be like that as well.
You're speaking, aren't you? That would be very exciting.
Yeah, so my first in-person event in about 3 or 4 years speaking. So I'm excited.
That's good.
Yeah. Okay, so the event was for 3 days plus the extra day at the start for the co-hosted events. Maybe we could step through each day and what was happening that day, and maybe 1 or 2 key talks or really interesting talks or things you took away from each day.
So we'll start with the co-hosted events day, which I will call day 1, even though it's kind of day 0, I guess. That was Observability Day for me. There were many options available to me. I was debating with WASM, WebAssembly, but observability for me is the most interesting topic. And the first session I went to was a practitioner session from a guy called Gustavo from a company called Vtex. And it was all about essentially getting logs, metrics, and traces using an entirely open source stack doesn't require vendor lock-in at large scale. So 6.5 terabytes, I think it was, of data a day, which is obviously quite impressive. Yeah. And again, it was the first session of the event that I went to, and it was the first session that OpenTelemetry focused at, which unsurprisingly, not just at Observability Day, but also at all of KubeCon, was a large focus of quite a lot of the sessions. So much so that by the end, I started to go to different types of session rather than as OpenTelemetry focused ones. And that's because they kind of varied in nature from, this is what OpenTelemetry is, a sort of flavor for it, to practitioner sessions. But once, there was quite a lot of similarity between the sessions, the focus on OpenTelemetry. But that's okay. It was really interesting. Going back to this particular session, one thing that made this particularly interesting was they tried to use as much open source as possible, but they did end up writing their own telemetry collectors for things. And it was interesting as to kind of why. And in some cases, it's because there weren't sort of, off-the-shelf collectors they could use, but they did use as much off-the-shelf stuff as possible. Obviously, the scale was quite impressive. But also they focused on sharding for resiliency. So it did, at least on paper, sounded like quite an impressive deployment of what you could do with OpenTelemetry and without vendor lock-in.
Did they talk about why they decided to go completely open source? Is it just about cost, or because they think it's better than what commercial tools can provide, or avoiding vendor lock-in? What was the justification for that?
So in the case of this session, it was to avoid vendor lock-in. But that's an interesting question. For quite a few of the sort of practitioner sessions, it felt more like a philosophical answer. Like, this is how we work, and this is part of our company ethos and culture. Which is quite interesting to me, because that's less sort of tangible than it's the money or whatever it might be. But yeah, in this case, it was to avoid vendor lock-in, and they were talking about Splunk and how they were locked into that vendor before, which makes kind of sense. That's the nature of a historical vendor. They want to lock you in. The thing that came out from this session, but from a number of sessions, was how heavily Prometheus kind of features. I mean, obviously Prometheus and Kubernetes, not really that surprising, but it did seem like, more so than I was expecting, the de facto place to go and store your metrics, regardless if you use Prometheus for nothing else. It was just everywhere, which was interesting and makes total sense. It's good at what it does at the end of the day. Yeah.
And I think part of that is that, and I know from what people tell me, I'm not like an expert in OpenTelemetry at all, but the metrics isn't that mature compared to, say, the tracing aspect of OpenTelemetry. So I suspect that people will continue to use Prometheus at least until it metrics gets to a certain level of maturity, or maybe even beyond, because it's so battle tested. Yeah, but I do find it a little bit interesting that it's so popular, given that PromQL, the language you use to query it, is, I find, the most painful language I've ever written. It's just every single time I do it, I have to look up things and try trial and error. It's very, very difficult for me to understand. So,
well, I have no experience really with Prometheus, hands-on experience with Prometheus. Well, I'm sure that's true. I guarantee that will come down to familiarity. People just know it now because they've been working with it for so many years. And while there might be things out there that are better, it's the whole Betamax VHS conversation, isn't it, basically? People are used to it, and therefore it sticks. So much so that other providers are implementing PromQL support for their tool, because people are just used to using PromQL. And I know the next question is going to be who, and I can't remember specifically who said that.
It's a bit like the QWERTY keyboard, and it's designed to make you type as slow as possible to stop the typewriter things getting caught up, and we still use it today, even though it's completely inefficient.
Yes. So yeah, Observability Day, the first day, lots of sessions on OpenTelemetry. There was a session on histograms in Grafana that was kind of interesting, although it went from high-level overview to detail really, really, really quickly. And so my eyes kind of glazed over when we got to when you see a command prompt pop up. That's not my sort of session. But lots and lots of focus on OpenTelemetry, and this is definitely my favorite session of the day on that day one.
I am definitely jumping ahead a bit here, but seeing as we're talking about OpenTelemetry right now, it's always a big topic in the observability space and the industry. And I was wondering, by what you saw at KubeCon, how do you feel about OpenTelemetry? Is it what it is being promoted as? Is it really that good?
That's an interesting question. It's quite quickly gone from what is OpenTelemetry to people are actually deploying it at scale, in my sort of what I see of it, which is obviously a limited slice of the world. It did feel like people were having real world success with it. And obviously those are people that have had success and are wanting to talk about their story. And when you go to an event like KubeCon, it's in the interest of the people organizing it to promote things that talk about OpenTelemetry. So I still have some skepticism, but it does really seem like there has been success with OpenTelemetry. Another sort of thing that points in this direction was Elasticsearch and OpenTelemetry are bringing together their schema definitions, which was quite interesting, and standardizing on OpenTelemetry's semantic conventions, which was a good piece of news for kind of everyone. The fewer standards, the better, the more people can standardize. But it's another thing that points to, well, looks like one of the two is kind of winning when it comes to a convention for defining these things. Does that answer your question, or would you like to go deeper?
No, it sort of does answer my question. I guess another way of sort of framing it would be for what I call sort of real world regular organizations, because most organizations of the world are just enterprises or government departments that don't have massive scale. They have lots of tech debt and complexity, and they can't afford the engineers who work at the FANG companies and that kind of thing. It's a very different context. I would be curious to know whether OpenTelemetry is working for those kind of companies yet.
I would be willing to put money on the fact the answer is no, but not because of OpenTelemetry itself, just because any new technology takes more time. The whole on-prem to cloud thing is a perfect example of this. We've been talking about cloud first, cloud transitions for a decade plus, and from the customers that I speak to in my day job, it's actually happening at those large enterprises now. It's not to do with the technology; it's to do with the fact those guys just move so slow, rather than necessarily the technology. But it does feel like OpenTelemetry is there, and it is kind of ready. It's just the adoption, rather than necessarily it's missing this, that, and the other at this stage for me.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think OpenTelemetry, as I get more familiar with it, it's going to be the thing that I talk about more and want to promote more, probably. So I guess maybe my challenge will be, how can I take the goodness of OpenTelemetry or Prometheus and put it in a language or in a way which a traditional enterprise can say, yes, I understand, that makes sense, or that fits in what we want to do, and it fits into our vision and where we want to go. So yeah. That's cool.
I think the big piece of that's going to be dependent on what tools enterprises use. If you get someone like Splunk that go, we're going to support OpenTelemetry, that would be a very interesting conversation. Because then it's a tool that the enterprises are already likely to have, because it's been around for 15 years now. It would take something like that to really speed up OpenTelemetry adoption, I think.
Well, I'm not sure about Splunk, but I know that many commercial tools are supporting it. But from the point of view of they support getting data out of the collector that you've instrumented using OpenTelemetry, but a lot of vendors still want you to store your data in their tool, because that's good for them, and
And then they make it difficult to get your data out of their tool, because that's how they work, and then you have vendor lock-in. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that was day zero, or the co-hosted events. What about the rest of the conference?
Okay, so day one then, which was the start of sort of proper KubeCon, if you will, kicked off with keynotes. Every day started with keynotes. But on this day, I missed the keynotes because we were visiting a customer, which was actually quite interesting, because the customer we went to was a Microsoft shop. And so it was really interesting to have these two worlds right next to each other to be able to directly compare and contrast. It did really emphasize the fact that CNCF and the Linux Foundation and KubeCon felt much more open than kind of the Microsoft background that I'm from. That's my world. Essentially, it's been my career. It was just a really interesting contrast. But anyway, it meant that I missed the keynotes, but the sessions then spanned from the beginning of actual KubeCon about sort of 25 tracks, and they were quite wide and diverse. There was stuff in there focused on AI and, as you would expect, and security and observability. But everyone has their areas of interest and their areas of things they care about. And for me, that was observability, security, and CI/CD. That's primarily where I spent my time. Also a bit of the sustainability, environmental bits and pieces. Which was interesting, another interesting point, because that was featured in the keynotes, but it felt like it was early days. And I'll kind of come on to that a bit later on, because I did go to a couple of sessions on that side of things as well, sustainability specifically in Kubernetes, but in cloud computing. So the first session I went to that was sort of noteworthy of that first full day was called Fight Back Against Cyber Risk in the Software Supply Chain with a Secure and Compliant DevSecOps Pipeline for Regulated Environments. Now, the bits of that title that interested me were DevSecOps and Supply Chain. I'm thinking of SolarWinds, the SolarWinds supply chain issue that everyone I'm sure out there will know about.
I don't. Sorry. What is a SolarWinds supply chain issue?
Oh, interesting. So they basically got breached, and in their source code, effectively, a vulnerability was inserted, which meant that when that product was compiled and shipped to customers, that vulnerability was in customer deployments as a virtue of being in the source.
Wow.
Through consumption of downstream components. It's very rare in software that the company that sells the software writes it all. It's all lots of open source modules that are brought in and compiled. So thinking of the list from previous employment places, we're talking like a large enterprise bit of software will have maybe 50 bits of open source software in it that are brought in from various places. And obviously there's you've got to keep all that stuff up to date, and you've got to attribute them and make sure they're licensed and whatnot. But basically, it's another place that vulnerabilities can be inserted. So unfairly, it's been dubbed the SolarWinds thing, the SolarWinds vulnerability issue. Obviously, it could happen to anyone. Yeah. But what it comes down to is securing your CI/CD pipeline. And this is an area I've got some form in from my old place, where we did have security and source code scanning built into our CI/CD pipeline. So I was interested to see in the sort of 5 years I've been at sort of Squared Up and Cookdown, what's changed in this area. And the good news for me, given that tech moves so fast, is that quite a lot of it was the same, which was great news after so much to kind of learn and understand and get up to speed with for the first time in a while. I'm sure everyone out there can resonate. That resonates with them. But there were a few things that were new. The notion of a secure bill of materials in SBOM was new, which is essentially the notion of these are the bits and pieces that are meant to make up this package, this whatever it is that's being deployed by the pipeline. So if there's something that isn't on this list, it's something that shouldn't be there. So it makes sense, logical. And then the notion of securing that and storing it in somewhere that's secure and signing it to make sure that it can't be tampered. Like, yeah, makes total sense. And then the other thing, which was new to me, but again makes sense focusing on supply chain, was they called it continuous compliance. But essentially, it's using all of the tools you would use as far as source code scanning and your SBOM to scan something once it's been deployed, even if there are no changes. It's like, but why would you do that? It's like, well, because there are vulnerabilities that appear after the software has been compiled, deployed, shipped, whatever. Obviously, it's more applicable to sorts of software that is sort of packaged and sent to customers, but equally important for cloud as well. You want to make sure that your SaaS product has no vulnerabilities in it at the end of the day. So that was interesting. I think this one was a vendor session in disguise, because at the end there was a come to our booth, like, aha, I see you. But at the end,
you can't trick me.
You can't trick me, not this time. But yeah, it was a good session because there was value in the content. It wasn't just this is our tool. In fact, there was very little of that, which is why I didn't realize till the end.
Over days, sort of days 1, 2, and 3, all 3 days, what were maybe your top 2 or 3 most impactful sessions?
One of them, not necessarily for obvious reasons, was called the State of Green Software in Cloud Native. This one was interesting because all the sessions, all these projects that the CNCF spin out that they were presenting at KubeCon felt quite like mature, like they'd been around for a while. But this one didn't. This one was very early stage, a very early stage group, basically, designed to advise on environment. And it was very much every question that the audience asked was like, we don't know yet, we're still figuring it out, but get involved. So, interesting. And so much so that I'm debating whether to get involved in it myself, because it's an emerging area for a couple of reasons. EU law is legislating more reporting on things like carbon. And obviously that's got an impact that's more wide-reaching than tech, but it's certainly a piece of the puzzle. If as a software company, you don't ship physical products around the world. The vast majority of your carbon is produced by your data center, and looking at the sorts of suppliers you keep and what your staff do, flying to conferences and things like that. So that was a really interesting session. It was a full house, and it felt like it had real potential. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to have a look and get involved in it, because it sounds really cool.
I wonder, coming from performance testing engineering, that background, if there's a whole new future for people from that discipline around tuning and making systems and code more efficient, because it uses less electricity and it's better for the environment. And you can now have this whole career in green engineering.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the other one is FinOps, the discipline of saving money by reducing your cloud computing spend. Obviously, if you're reducing your cloud compute spend, it's probably because you're doing less with the cloud. You're right-sizing your deployments to use less powerful VMs, to pick on a sort of obvious example. Switching off stuff when you're not using it, it's all going to use less power and therefore be greener. There's another really good synergy that made total sense.
Okay, so the green session does sound interesting. What are the other 1 or 2 most impactful sessions?
The other session I'd highlight was my very last session of the whole thing, which was all about Psyllium. I'd never heard of Psyllium before KubeCon, or EBPF.
I have heard about that, yes.
Okay, interesting. It's interesting. It's again like coming from a Microsoft background. It's like, what is eBPF? It's not a thing that exists in the Microsoft space at all. There's been a port of eBPF for Windows, but it feels like, yeah, sure. It's just it's like we're there too, like tick box, rather than the fact it's actually a capability of Windows. But essentially, it's kernel level instrumentation and the ability to program at that level, so that you can do monitoring at that level without having to instrument all of your applications, which is really, really cool. It's like, yeah, kernel level makes so much sense, doesn't it? At the end of the day, you can't execute a workload without going through the kernel. So it's the perfect place to instrument. So the session was essentially how Psyllium uses eBPF, Prometheus, and Grafana to give you insights for an application that is sort of cross system, cross platform. And it did this by essentially instrumenting at the network layer of the OSI model, lower down the OSI model, I think level 3 from memory, though I haven't actually got that in my notes, so I could be wrong. But essentially, really, really cool use of Psyllium to be able to do things you otherwise wouldn't be able to do, and see things you wouldn't otherwise be able to do, like automatically generate service maps, service diagrams, and then layer data on top of them, like how many requests have been successful or have failed. It's possible to do via other means at the application layer, but the fact this is all effectively done with relative ease, frankly, it looked to me, obviously it's a session, so they would be presented that way, but that's very much how it felt. Because then you could focus in on the breakages between your microservices as they span boxes, which was really, really quite cool. And this was a fully packed session. I would guess it like, I don't know, 500 people, maybe more in this session. And there were people standing at the back. And at the beginning, they did a kind of straw poll. Who's using this technology? Who's using that technology? And everyone's hand went up for Prometheus. Was very like, oh, wow, it really is everywhere here. But yeah, very cool use of eBPF and to understand what Psyllium is, because again, I hadn't even heard of it, and let alone see it applied. Yeah, I would say those are probably my highlights.
I've only heard eBPF. I kind of heard of it, like you said, you can sort of you can instrument or have code running at this very deep kernel level, and it lets you do things like continuously profiling your code and every single line that gets executed and instruction and everything, and just which has a lot of potential, I think, and it sort of has stepped in where APM tools have maybe struggled in the last few years, whereas previously they had like Java or .NET based APM tools, and they did a good job, but things have been getting out of hand now. But with eBPF, we can get back on top of it.
And the more distributed an application is, the harder it is to get that insight with the traditional APM tool. It's a lot of work to go and instrument. The kernel level magic, that's how it was described originally to me by a colleague. It just makes sense, doesn't it? It's very cool technology. It's a shame it doesn't exist for the Microsoft Windows space, but one day, I'm sure.
Yeah. At this point, we kind of had some bad news, don't we, Bruce? Because
we do.
Bruce went to the event and he went around and interviewed a bunch of people and was asking them, what is your biggest, what's the biggest challenge you're trying to tackle with observability right now? That kind of question. And we have these great videos, and we recorded all the audio, and apparently the audio, the SD card with the audio got corrupted. So unfortunately, we wanted to be able to play the snippets back and then talk to them, but we don't have the snippets. So in saying that, Sonia Shivra from Tyke, Eric D. Chabelle from Chronosphere, Andy Grabner from Dynatrace and Captain, Ivan Merrill from Fiberplane, Max from Victoria Metrics. Unfortunately, you didn't get to speak on this episode, but you're more than welcome to come on the show anytime to talk about anything observability or SRE. So the open invitation to all of you to come on the show.
And I'm sorry for the SD card issue. It's one of those like, this is going to be great. I've got all these sessions, all very excited, downloading it all to my laptop in the airport, and then like, what's going on with this SD card? Uh-oh. So yes.
So we don't have the recordings, but you did take some notes from a couple of people who didn't want to be named. But someone who works at a retail bank said that his challenge was getting the balance right between storing too much data and not enough data. Everything was, terabytes a day. That's an interesting challenge. It's something I hear commonly in the industry. I haven't seen it myself because for whatever reason, we weren't storing that much data. It was, talking gigabytes a day as opposed to terabytes. Have you seen that with our customers or anyone else you know in the industry?
It is a common problem, absolutely. I think it's unique to OpenTelemetry. I'm trying to think of any mitigation I can say, but I think there really is. It's true of old monitoring tools, even. Interestingly about this particular person is I talked a bit about their background and their sort of like tech stack and things as well. And it did feel very traditional enterprise. They had Kubernetes in the mix, which is why they were here, but no mention of OpenTelemetry. They were storing data in Splunk. No openness about it, but this was their problem. This message was resonated by Eric from Chronosphere, who obviously Chronosphere as a product is all about this kind of thing, and quite a few of the vendors that were out there addressing this problem. But yeah, it does resonate with me and with customers I speak to.
I think there is a lot of instrumentation and just pulling everything back happening. And there's not enough being really thoughtful about what metrics we capture. So you install Prometheus and you install, any metrics endpoint, standard one out of the box, or any exporter that you install, like the node exporter, has just hundreds and hundreds of metrics that you just won't use 99.9% of them ever. You know what I mean? Like I've got to the point where I whitelist and say, I only want to see these 5 metrics because I know these are useful. And you know what? I might miss something, but then I can add to it later. It's a cost benefit thing, right? I can keep these 5 metrics, which are going to cover almost everything, and then we can have other ways to deal with the unexpected, like tracing.
It's going to be really interesting to see how things progress in this space when it comes to tracing, especially because tracing is like, obviously the definition of store everything. Essentially, you want the trace level data to be able to see exactly which line of code was executed when, which requires a trace statement, and they can be massive. Thinking about my Microsoft background, this is a problem we were discussing with SCOM, which is a Microsoft monitoring tool from 2012, was the last major revision in the context of alerts and storing too many alerts. And it came down to exactly what you're saying, whitelisting or tuning to make sure that you didn't just accept the out-of-the-box defaults. And when it came to alerts, you have AIOps as a whole like definite categorization of tool, which is all about correlating alerts from multiple sources to weed out the noise and reduce duplicates and all that kind of stuff. I'm really interested to see whether we're going to end up somewhere similar with likes of tracing and event data.
I think another big thing with tracing I've heard a lot about, don't have a lot of practical experience yet, is of course the aggregation method that you apply to it. Like, do you keep something simple and just keep 1%, randomly 1% of all samples, or do you have something a bit more fancy which says I want to keep traces for things that fail, and then you got your retention period as well. There's all kinds of things that you, again, have to be thoughtful about so that you're not storing huge amounts of data forever, which you will never use.
I imagine this problem is going to be compounded when you're in a regulated environment where you're forced to store. Everything you store, you have to store for a long period of time. This particular person was from a large bank. So I would guess, I'm not a banking expert, that there are regulations in the area that govern how long you have to store things for once captured. So then you have to be even more thoughtful about what you capture in the first place, because once it's on disk, that's it. You got to store it.
You took another note from someone else who was a dev at a software company making marketing software, who said her challenge was getting observability set up for all her tools as there were gaps in what they can see today. So it sounds like she's got some tooling, but there are gaps in visibility.
Essentially blind spots. That's exactly the message. It felt to me, I did a bit of research into the company, which you won't obviously mention, that they are earlier on in their sort of growth. They haven't got like decades worth of monitoring and observability experience in the same way that the other person I spoke to had. So this is just about getting set up in the first place. If this were a maturity model, this would be kind of step one, wouldn't it? Essentially, cover all your blind spots, pull all your tools together. Then you've got the problem of too much data, I'm sure. But yeah, this very much felt like blind spots and gaps in coverage. And this particular person, she was a software developer, and she was at KubeCon. They do use Kubernetes, but she was mostly there for all the other cloud native stuff, and just to see what was out there. Not exclusively for kind of tool selection, but to see what could help with this challenge and this problem. Yeah, interesting, but did feel like earlier in their maturity.
Yeah, I think two things immediately come to mind with blind spots is you really can't get away with not having distributed tracing with distributed complex systems at this point, which is, I've come around to that idea. I believe it. I think it's just too hard to just rely on logs and metrics to do it. And the other thing that comes to mind is you can have distributed tracing, but if you have lots of teams who will co-own big systems and the sort of team structure and ownership model isn't right, or if the problem has been broken up into small enough chunks to be owned by teams, then that makes it hard too. Because you can have visibility of your bit of the pie, but then you might have 10 other teams that you depend on to provide a single customer service. Do they have the distributed tracing and their monitoring set up as well? And it becomes, at that point, less about technology and more about culture and structure and organization, those things.
Yeah, and ownership, the classic. It always seems to come down, in my experience, come down to ownership. It's all well and good collecting all this data, but if you can't point your finger at somebody and go, the problem is in your area, go have a look. It's really difficult. Yeah, distributed tracing. I think you're absolutely right, especially with CI/CD. So we're moving faster, and SaaS, where you haven't got this is the build. It's over here. It's this version. Are you talking about version A or version B? You haven't got that luxury anymore. And it's one of those things that, frankly, in my old company, I took for granted because we had distributed tracing before it was cool. I'm going back like to 2008. I didn't know it was even called that, but it was essential for, I'm talking about Citrix. We had a low-level, kernel-level crash. The 10,000th time you logged in and logged out from a virtual desktop, and it would blue screen, and you'd get a mini dump, and it would give you very little information. So you would need distributed tracing to be able to figure out when an asynchronous call is happening in the wrong order, which is causing the blue screen. It was just vital, but I took it for granted, frankly. So when I saw tools like Jaeger, and just went, oh, that's how you visualize your trace. Because we would always just pass it in text form. Again, going back to 2008, I'm sure there were tools being used other places in Citrix. But it was fantastic. And I just thought, this is just what everyone has. Wrong, it turns out.
We are coming up on time, but I did want to ask you a couple more things around what you took away from the event. So obviously it was a different kind of event than you'd been to in the past. I wanted to know, did you learn anything from the event which you will take and apply in your work in a real practical sense?
Well, the first thing, I don't know about practical, but given the nature of my role, is very important. It felt like if 100% of tech is this big bubble, and you slice it down the middle, you've got Microsoft stuff on one side. That's my history. It felt like I was opening the door on a whole new world, and there's just every Microsoft tool I'm familiar with, there is an open source Linux vendor-based alternative. And this is true to some extent in the Microsoft space with the vendor piece, but it really felt like that on steroids here. So I think it opened up more questions than necessarily it answered, which is good because it means my world is sort of bigger now. That's the first thing I would take. And the second thing is, given, I'm a product guy, and, I was there to understand sort of the space and what we could plug into Squared Up particularly, it really reinforced the importance of Prometheus. It is everywhere in this space. So just the value of making whatever we build for Prometheus really, really strong and up there was really reinforced by this event. Yeah, I'd say those are the two biggest things I took away.
And the last thing, is there anything you heard at the event which you just disagreed with? Anything like, I hear things all the time, I'm like, it doesn't sound right. You prove it to me or I don't believe you kind of thing. But anything you disagreed with?
Whenever there's a big trend, like we've talked about OpenTelemetry today, and it's sort of stood up on a pedestal as this is the only way, this is the answer to your prayers. While however good or bad OpenTelemetry as an example may be, to always take those sorts of comments with a pinch of salt, because no one tool, no one technological solution is the answer to all of your prayers. Yeah. The other thing that I would say is that there was people pitching a sort of a technology journey, life cycle kind of journey, starting with mainframes, going through, bare metal operating system installed stuff, to VMs, to Kubernetes, and that really cloud native is the ultimate destination, I think. But quite a few of these sessions were pitching something else that's somewhere in between cloud native and Kubernetes as the answer to that question. So, not sure I buy that.
So what's an example of something that's in between the old world and the cloud native world?
WebAssembly tech. It's very cool, don't get me wrong, but versus cloud native, it felt like a step backwards. Though obviously for some workloads and applications, it will make sense, I'm sure.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for not only coming on the show again to talk about your experiences at KubeCon, but for going to KubeCon and talking to people and doing all this research on my behalf, because obviously I couldn't be there. Maybe I'll come to KubeCon with you next year.
I'm up for that. Any odd excuse to talk to people, send me out anytime you want, Stephen.
Thank you once again for tuning into Slight Reliability. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time.